Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Now before I start with this week's Tuesday tips, I just wanted to mention that for some reason in the area today, dogs are barking. So you might be hearing some barking on video as well. So I apologize for that and please just ignore that. But I've been putting this camera on and off and restarting my videos because of the dogs barking. Now today's tip video is going to be for all of you that is new to sewing, especially garment sewing. I want to speak to you about the importance of seam allowances. I think this is something that we don't always share all this information with you because we just assume that people know what a seam allowance is. So I really wanted to go more into the importance of that seam allowance and why. The first thing that I want you to do, if you take a pattern and you take that leaflet, that you go and have a look what that seam allowance is going to be. Now let's look at our commercial patterns. We know that most of the commercial patterns out there will work on a standard seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters or our 5/8 of an inch. But you still want to go make sure, because I have found some patterns which the measurement is totally different. If we go and look at our quick sew patterns, I can tell you now there's a lot of quick sew patterns out there, especially the knit patterns that's working on a 6 millimeter or a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now we've also got our independent pattern design companies out there, what we call our indie patterns, and those guys are also working sometimes on their own seam allowances. So a lot of them are working on 1 centimeter instead of our 1.5 centimeters. So can you see why you have to make sure that when you get a pattern, the first thing you're going to do, you want to go and look for any information where it's actually going to tell you what the seam allowance is. Don't assume it's just 1.5 centimeters. And this one specifically that I have as well, this is a simplicity pattern. You will find on these commercial patterns, you always get these instructional leaflets. And on the first page where you see the pattern pieces, somewhere there it will tell you general directions, and I want you to go and look for seam allowance because that is where you will see the seam allowance. And you will sometimes see that they'll also tell you seam allowance is 1.5 centimeters unless otherwise stated on your pattern piece. You might find on the pattern piece itself, on the neck curve, they might tell you that that seam allowance is going to be 1 centimeter instead of 1.5. Can you see how you've got to make sure that you look at your pattern? You look at the instructions, you look at your pattern pieces. Go and make sure that you've got the correct seam allowance. Now, why is it so important for you to work the correct seam allowance? So that pattern piece will always give us information on finished garment measurements. If you go and look on your pattern piece, on the front pattern piece, or even if it's not there, somewhere on the envelope, it will give you finished garment measurements. And I work mostly on that finished garment measurement instead of the sizing that I've got to go and choose. Now, they are telling you, let's just, for instance, say the garment measurement on the bust is 100 centimeters. And that is now working with their seam allowance that has been worked into this pattern piece. Now, if I go and I work with a smaller seam allowance, so I'm not taking out that full amount of seam allowance, I'm actually adding onto that pattern, making that finished garment measurement bigger. If I do the opposite now and I'm actually working out a bigger seam allowance than what's allowed for, I'm actually sizing down a little bit. Can you see how I can affect the fit of that garment? I can end up with a garment that is going to be way too tight on my body or very loose on my body because I didn't stick to the seam allowance. Now I'm just going to do a demonstration for you on how the seam allowance can affect the pattern pieces, and this is really for my beginner garment sewers. I want you to visually see what effect that seam allowance will have on my pattern piece. Now remember, pattern pieces will always tell you on the pattern somewhere, and it's usually on the front pattern piece or somewhere on your envelope. If you're working with the commercial patterns, it will tell you exactly what the finished measurement will be. Now if you are looking at my outline that I've done here, that will basically be your cutting line on your pattern pieces. I've just gone and drawn another line for us, which is our stitching line. So imagine your big pattern piece that tells you size 14, that's where you're going to cut. If you measure in from your cutting line your 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and now we're just going to work with 1.5 all the way through, and you go and draw a line there, that will basically be your stitching line. I've just gone and colored in the side seams here just so you can see my seam allowance. So this blue is now representing our seam allowance. This line is our stitching line. Now let's say I am not following the instructions and I am going and I'm sewing 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm just going to go and visually draw a line here for us. So I am sewing here instead of on my stitching line where I should be sewing. So I am actually sewing on this spot. Now if I have to pin my fabric together and I'm sewing on this line, look at this extra bit. And I'm doing lines for you. All of a sudden I've enlarged my pattern piece. Look at this. So now where I would have had a certain measurement from the center to the underarm point and also on that section there, whatever measurement I would have had, which is recommended for the pattern, now I've added on, let's say, a 1/2 centimeter and a 1/2 centimeter there. So that is giving me 1 centimeter on one side, on that one seam. And remember, we're working with 2 side seams. So now I've added on 5 millimeters and 5 on the front, 5 millimeters on the back. So that's 1 centimeter, and that is for the left side. So now let's say I go to the right side, I've done the same. Now I've added on 2 centimeters already. So I've affected the fit of my garment. I have made my garment bigger. So I am not going to get the fit that I wanted. So now let's imagine you're working with another pattern that is asking only for a 6 millimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. But you didn't go and read your pattern instructions. You didn't see that it's 6 millimeters. So you assumed, like all patterns, it will be 1.5 centimeters. So now instead of having, and we're just imagining this being 1/4 inch. So let's say I'm going in and I am actually now sewing 1.5 centimeters, which could have been that line over there. And I'm going to draw it there. So now I'm ending up with a bigger seam allowance, and look what that bigger seam allowance has done. It started taking in the pattern. So I am actually going and taking away from the size. So instead of it maybe, let's say my pattern said finished measurement was 100 centimeters over the bust area. Now I have gone, instead of 6 millimeters, I've done 1.5 centimeters. Let's just round it off. I've gone and taken an extra centimeter off here on the front. I've taken an extra centimeter off on the back. That's giving me 2 centimeters already on one side seam, plus my other side seam. That's giving me 4 centimeters. So now I'm sitting with a pattern that is 4 centimeters smaller than what it's supposed to be. So I might not even be able to get this onto my body. I hope that showing you the lines actually makes you realize how it affects your pattern piece. So again, let's just have a look at it, and I'm just going to go over it again because I want you to understand. My original stitch line is this dark line that we are seeing on both pattern pieces. That would have been the correct size if I actually sewed 1.5 centimeters. Now I am sewing maybe 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm not taking off the full amount of seam allowance. So now what's going to happen? I have increased the circumference of my pattern. I have added onto the pattern, making it bigger. So I'm going to have a pattern piece, or I'm going to have a garment that's now going to be bigger than what the pattern allowed for. If I'm going to go and I'm sewing more than what it's allowed, we are now saying, let's say you worked with a pattern that said only 6 millimeters or 1 centimeter seam allowance, and you again went and sewed more than that 1 centimeters. So let's say instead of 1 centimeter, you went and sewed 1.5 because you didn't go and look what the seam allowance is for the pattern. Now I'm actually taking off, and look at this. I'm taking a lot off of my circumference. Look at this. All right, so all of that is removed. Now I should have been sewing here. So whatever I've taken off extra is making my garment smaller. And if I'm specifically working on a woven, I might battle to get this over the body. It's going to feel as if there's no movement for me in this garment whatsoever. It's going to be too tight. So that is really the effect if we are looking at garment sewing. We are either going to get too big or a too small pattern piece if I don't stick to the seam allowance. If we are looking at the stitch plate, you will see all these lines that I have on my stitch plate. Now, all our sewing machines will have some sort of guideline on our stitch plates. It might not tell you exactly what the measurement is, it might just be guidelines, and you can then go and measure from the center of your needle, and you can measure to that line and see exactly what the measurement is so that you know what will be 1.5 centimeter or 1 centimeter. Now on my stitch plate, if we are looking at it, you can see I've got lines on the front area of the stitch plate. Those are for those working in inches, also great for our quilters. And then because I do garment sewing, I love working with the back lines because that is my seam allowances when I'm working in metric. And you will also notice now that I have one that says 7.5 millimeters. And then you will see right next to it, there's another line, and that will be my 1 centimeter. So it's not numbered or saying 10, but I know that is my 1 centimeter. And then I also have the 15, which is my guideline for my 1.5 seam allowance. So this is the one that I would use most of the time. And then you can see the next one going on, that will give 2 centimeters, 2.5. So these are all spaced 5 millimeters apart. So great for me when I am working with seam allowances and I want to be accurate. If you're enjoying my tips videos that I'm sharing with you, I'm going to ask you to please share these videos and also to go and subscribe if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet. Remember to go click on that bell as well and choose all so that you do get notifications when I upload all the videos. So that is it for this week. Happy sewing.